The forms were still on the desk when I walked in. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the equipment ranked along the processing bays, not the overhead tracks on which the conveyance frames still hung at rest, not the smell, which I had been warned about and which no warning had adequately prepared me for. It was the forms. A tray of them, on a desk just inside the main intake corridor of Theresi Processing Station Verith 7, neatly stacked, the top sheet still weighted down by a small polished stone, the way you might hold paperwork in a drafty office. The Theresi script ran in precise columns across the page. I had a translation overlay in my visor, and I stood there long enough to read the top form in full before I moved further inside. It was an intake log, species designation, physical assessment grade, substrate yield projection, recommended processing lane. There was a column for the human's name. In the one completed form I could see beneath the weighted stone, a name had been entered in the Latin alphabet, phonetically approximated. Sorel Hahn, colony of origin, Calder's margin, age 31, substrate yield, category B prime. Under notes, in the Theresi administrative hand, someone had written what translated as, cooperative transit, no complications. I set that form back down exactly as I had found it, and I moved deeper into the facility. My name is Cale Dorn. I held the rank of senior field medic, attached to the 4th reckoning assessment element of the rendered accounts fleet. I was not a soldier. I had not fired a weapon in the course of this operation, and I would not. The 803 warships of the rendered accounts fleet had done their work from orbit. The ground assessment elements were something else: forensic, clinical, cataloging. My kit contained a medical scanner, a portable documentation array, a carbon-sealed evidence container, and a sidearm I never drew. My job was to walk inside what the fleet strikes had left standing, or into what had been surrendered intact, and to determine as precisely as the evidence allowed what the Theresi had done inside, what the instruments, the tanks, the overhead tracks and the neat intake forms and the polished stone paperweights amounted to, when you translated them out of administrative language and into the physical fact of 6,211,408 human beings. I had been selected for the assessment role partly because of my 17 years of field medicine experience, which the selection board had determined made me capable of reading the physical evidence in the processing facilities with a level of clinical accuracy that a non-medical assessor might miss. And partly, I think, because I was from Calder's Margin originally. My family had moved there when I was 4 years old, and I had grown up there until I left for the medical service at 19. And Calder's Margin was one of the 3 outer ring colony worlds from which the highest documented rates of disappearance had been recorded in the CD's 11-year file. The people the Theresi had taken were disproportionately from the outer ring, from the colonies that were newer and more isolated, and whose populations were more mobile, and whose administrative integration with Earth's core systems was less complete. The places from which a person could go missing and the absence could be attributed, for months or years, to the ordinary difficulties of outer colony record-keeping before anyone began to ask the right questions. Calder's Margin was that kind of place. I had grown up in it. I knew the texture of it, the distance between the settled zones and the nearest relay station. The way a communication delay of 4 or 5 days in each direction became, in practice, the assumption that messages had simply not arrived yet, the normalcy of gaps in the records. I had not thought of it as a vulnerability when I was young. I had thought of it as the ordinary character of a colony world in its 2nd generation of settlement, which was what it was. But the CD file had a section on methodology of acquisition, the ways in which the Theresi's administrative agents had identified and extracted people from the outer ring colonies, and the outer ring's administrative character was central to that methodology. And reading that section of the file on the transit out had recontextualized things I had not known needed recontextualizing. I am from Calder's Margin. Sorel Hahn was from Calder's Margin. I do not know if we ever passed each other on a transit dock or stood in the same queue at a colonial registry or breathed the same cold morning air coming off the northern shelf. Probably not. The colony was not small, and the years would likely not have aligned. But probably is not certainly, and the intake form had been on the desk in Verith 7's corridor for long enough that it was the first thing I found, and so Sorel Hahn became the name I carried before I had collected any of the others. It was the 3rd day of ground assessment on Theresi Primary. The fleet had gone quiet above. The strikes were complete on this world. We had landed through a daylit sky that was the color of old copper. The Theresi sun smaller and more orange than Sol, and the ground under my boots was a hard reddish dust that coated everything within minutes. The processing stations were built in industrial zones outside the administrative cities. Low, broad structures, functional rather than monumental, The way a slaughterhouse is built with attention to drainage and throughput rather than grandeur. Nothing about them announced what they were to someone who did not already know. They might have been pharmaceutical plants. They might have been water treatment facilities. They had their own road network, their own logistics infrastructure, their own tidy perimeter signage and Theresi administrative script. The fleet had struck the military and governmental infrastructure first, on day 1 and 2. The processing stations had been addressed on day 3, by which point most of the Theresi administrative personnel had evacuated or gone into the shelters. Vareth 7 was intact. The strike that had been assigned to it had been diverted to a secondary military target that appeared on updated intelligence at 0340 on day 3, and so Vareth 7 stood as it had stood for the past 61 years of its operational life. The lights on, the ventilation running, the forms on the desk, the polished stone holding the top sheet flat. I was the first human being to enter it voluntarily. I want to be careful about that word. Voluntarily, because the records we had assembled before the fleet ever broke transit, the records that had taken the Colonial Intelligence Directorate 11 years to compile, cross-reference, and verify to the threshold of certainty that would authorize what came next. Those records indicated that somewhere between 14 and 18,000 human beings had entered facilities of this type involuntarily. In the course of events they were told constituted resettlement assistance, emergency medical transit, colonial registration, or humanitarian relocation. Told this by Theresi administrative representatives, who spoke with the easy authority of a species that had been managing interstellar bureaucracy for 30,000 years. Told this and believed it, because the Theresi were not a species anyone had reason to distrust, because they sat on 7 different galactic compacts and 4 humanitarian convention bodies, because they had, in the previous 2 centuries, provided genuine material assistance to 12 separate species experiencing colonial distress, because their paperwork was always in order. Their paperwork had always been in order. I worked through the intake corridor first, documenting methodically the desk, the forms, the polished stone, the secondary screening booth where the physical assessment grades had been assigned, the overhead lighting that was still the particular quality of institutional blue-white that I recognized, with a sour turn in my stomach, as the specific spectrum Theresi biological science had determined produced the least stress response in human subjects during initial processing. A detail that appeared in internal Theresi research documents from 60 years ago, cross-referenced in the CID file, and which meant that someone, 60 years ago, had sat down and worked out how to make the lighting calming for the humans so the intake would go smoothly. Cooperative transit, no complications. There were 11 processing bays in Vareth 7. Each bay was approximately 40 meters long and 12 meters wide, with the overhead conveyance tracks running the length of the ceiling and a drainage channel cut into the floor along the center line. The equipment along the walls was medical industrial in its design. The Theresi aesthetic was clean, rounded, functional, but its purpose was not medical. My scanner identified the processing compound's residue in the first bay before I had gone 10 meters. Inside, a particular enzymatic cocktail, specific to the biological breakdown of human connective tissue, that had no therapeutic application I had ever encountered in my 15 years as a field medic. It was a processing agent. It accelerated the reduction of biological material to stable substrate, the form in which it could be stored, transported, and eventually administered as the active compound in the Theresi longevity treatment. The Theresi longevity treatment. I had read the file on this at length before we broke transit, because I had wanted to understand the mechanism not out of any clinical curiosity, but because I had found, over the years, that the things I could not understand sat heavier than the things I could. And I wanted this one to sit as lightly as I was capable of making it sit. The treatment worked by introducing a substrate compound derived from the biological material of a Class 7 organism. The CID file was dry on this. Point clinical, the language of a biological assessment into the Theresi cellular repair cycle, where it functioned as an enzyme catalyst that extended the active repair period by a factor of between 14 and 22, depending on individual Theresi genetics. The treatment extended Theresi lifespan by between 40 and 70 years. It had been in use for 140 years. It was administered to approximately 40 million Theresi per year across the Compact's 11 worlds, 40 million doses per year for 140 years. The substrate yield from a Category B' human adult was sufficient to produce between 80 and 140 doses of the treatment, depending on processing efficiency and the individual's biological material profile. I did the arithmetic once on the transit out when the numbers were still abstract. I did not do it again inside Vareth 7. The numbers were not abstract inside Vareth 7. I moved through each of the 11 bays in sequence, spending between 20 and 40 minutes in each, documenting the equipment, the residue traces, the maintenance logs that were still accessible on the facility terminals. The Theresi administrative culture was meticulous. They kept records of everything, cycle counts for the processing equipment, yield figures per batch, quarterly efficiency assessments. There was a graph on the terminal in Bay 6 that showed substrate yield per human intake against projected Theresi longevity treatment demand, plotted quarterly, running back to the facility's opening 61 years ago. The line for demand was a gentle upward slope. The line for yield tracked it with administrative precision. It had never occurred to anyone who drew that graph that it would ever be seen from the other side. I sat in front of that terminal for 11 minutes. I know because my documentation array timestamps everything automatically. I sat there and I looked at that graph and I thought about Sorel Han from Calder's Margin, who had been 31 years old and cooperative during transit. And I thought about the 11 other people whose names I had found in intake forms since entering this facility, and I thought about the 47 other facilities like this one that existed across Theresi Primary and its 6 subsidiary worlds, and I thought about the Fourth Reckoning Assessment Element's other 6 medics, who were inside those other facilities right now, running the same documentation procedure I was running. And I thought about what their scanners were finding in their bays, and what their terminals were showing them. Then I noted the graph in my documentation log, captured the full dataset, flagged it Category 1 evidence, and moved to Bay 7. The fleet had been silent above for most of that day. The strikes on the military infrastructure had been completed. The governmental administrative centers had been addressed. The Theresi Compact's Central Military Command on this world had ceased to exist on day 1, along with its 2 orbital defense stations, its 4 shipyard complexes, and its fleet of 112 warships, none of which had been newer than 40 years old, none of which had ever been designed with a conflict of this scale in mind, because the Theresi had not fought a peer-level adversary in 3,000 years, and had in the interim allowed their military capacity to decline to the level of system policing and compact enforcement, which was all they had needed. They had not expected this. That was in the record too. The CID file included intercepts from the Theresi Compact's internal communications in the 18 months before the fleet broke transit, and across all of them ran a consistent thread. The Theresi administrative and diplomatic class were aware that the resettlement programs had been discovered, were aware that human intelligence services had been compiling evidence, and had assessed with near unanimity that the human response would be diplomatic and legal, that humans would file a compact grievance, seek reparations, perhaps impose trade sanctions. Several of the intercepts discussed the likely settlement figure. One senior Theresi Compact official had authored a memorandum assessing that the maximum probable consequence was a reparations payment equivalent to approximately 4% of the Compact's annual trade revenue, which he described as manageable. His memo was dated 11 months before the rendered accounts fleet broke transit. I was in Bay 9 when my comm opened and the element leader, Senior Assessment Officer Marek Voss, told me we had a situation at the facility perimeter. A group of Theresi administrative personnel had emerged from the secondary shelter complex 800 meters north and were requesting to speak with the assessment team. They were unarmed. They were carrying a white and gold fabric, the Theresi formal symbol of diplomatic request. There were 9 of them. I told Voss I would finish Bay 9 and then come to the perimeter. I finished Bay 9. When I came to the perimeter, the 9 Theresi were standing in the reddish dust 20 meters from the facility's main entrance, which was where Voss had asked them to wait. The Theresi were bipedal, roughly human in their physical proportion, though taller. The shortest of the 9 stood perhaps 1 meters, with a secondary skeletal structure running along the outer forearms that functioned as a kind of radiative cooling system and gave them a distinctive silhouette. Their skin was a pale gray blue. They were old, most of them. The Theresi aged visibly after their 7th decade, and several of the 9 had the characteristic deepened coloring and slowed movement of advanced age. The one who stepped forward to speak was perhaps 80 years old by human reckoning, ancient even for a Theresi, and the longevity treatment was perhaps the reason for that, a thought I filed away without examining it. He spoke in compact standard, which my visor translated in real time. He said that the 9 of them were members of the Vareth Administrative Compact, the regional governance body for this part of Theresi Primary. He said that they had been in the shelter complex and had monitored the fleet's operations from there, and they wished to formally surrender the administrative jurisdiction of the Varith region on behalf of the compact. He said that they understood the circumstances of the fleet's arrival and wished to offer full cooperation. He said that they had prepared documentation. He indicated a case one of the younger Theresi was carrying that included the complete records of all Theresi processing activities under the resettlement assistance protocols, including intake logs, yield figures, distribution records for the substrate compound, and the identities of the administrative personnel who had authorized and managed the protocols over their 140-year operational history. He said that they offered this documentation as a gesture of full transparency and cooperation and requested that this gesture be factored into whatever process of accountability was to follow. He said, and this was the part I found I could not move past quickly, the part that stayed with me through the remaining 31 days of that world's assessment. He said that the compact had not understood that the resettlement assistance protocols would be perceived as a hostile act. He said that the compact had not understood that humanity would classify the protocols as an act of war. He said that the compact had understood the protocols to fall within the category of resource utilization that was conventional under the older compact frameworks, and that humanity, as a relatively recent addition to the interstellar community, may not have been fully familiar with the historical context in which such frameworks had developed, and that the compact regretted any distress that may have resulted from this misunderstanding. He said the word misunderstanding. In compact standard, the precise word he used translated as a failure of mutual contextual awareness. Voss looked at me. I did not look back at him. I was watching the 9 Theresi, the old spokesman with his careful diplomatic posture, the others standing behind him, with their white and gold fabric and their case of documentation. I was thinking about Bay 6 and the graph on the terminal, the 2 lines tracking each other with administrative precision across 61 years of quarterly data. I was thinking about the lights calibrated to the spectrum that produced the least stress response in human subjects during initial processing. I was thinking about Sorel Han and the 11 other names I had collected from intake forms that morning, and the names I had not found because they had not been in this facility, because they had been in one of the other 47 facilities, and the names I had not found because record-keeping, even the meticulous Theresi record-keeping, was not perfect across 140 years, and some of the records from the early decades were incomplete. Voss transmitted the delegation's request up the assessment chain to the Fleet Operations Center aboard the flagship Calder's Reckoning. The response came back in 40 minutes. It was 3 sentences. I have the full text in my documentation archive. The first sentence acknowledged receipt of the delegation's communication. The second sentence noted that the rendered accounts fleet's operational mandate was set at the fleet command level, and that the delegation's request fell outside the parameters of the assessment element's authority to act upon. The third sentence stated that the fleet's operations would continue on the established schedule. Voss read it to the 9 Theresi. The old spokesman asked if there was an escalation pathway, a diplomatic representative they could address, a compact official they could reach, a process through which the formal surrender documentation and the evidence archive could be transmitted to a decision-making authority. Voss said he would pass the request up. The answer came back in 20 minutes. The documentation archive would be accepted and processed by the Fleet Intelligence Section as evidentiary material. The formal surrender would be noted in the operational record. The fleet's operations would continue on the established schedule. I watched the old spokesman absorb this. His secondary forearm structures, the cooling radiators, flattened against his arms, a Theresi stress response I had read about in the species briefing materials on the transit out. The younger Theresi behind him exchanged looks I could read without a translation overlay. He asked what the fleet's operations entailed, going forward. What remained to be addressed? Voss told him that the full operational manifest was not information the assessment element was authorized to share, but that the assessment element's function was to document the processing facilities, and that the assessment was ongoing, and that other elements of the fleet were conducting parallel assessments and operational activities across the compact's subsidiary worlds under the established schedule. He asked about those worlds. He asked whether the subsidiary world's civilian populations had been, he used a compound word that my overlay translated as, reached by the operational activity. Voss said that the operational briefings the element had received indicated that the fleet's strikes on the subsidiary worlds were targeting the same categories of infrastructure that had been addressed here: military, governmental, processing. The old spokesman was quiet for a long time. The dust moved in a low wind across the reddish ground between us. The Theresi sun was lower now, the copper sky deepening, and the ruins of the governmental administrative center 3 kilometers distant were a broken line against the horizon, still smoking in thin, pale columns that rose straight in the still air before the wind bent them. He said, "We did not know you would come." I said, and I want to be precise here, because I have thought about this exchange many times since, and I want the record to be accurate. I said, "I know." He said, "We thought you were a young civilization. We thought you did not yet have the capacity." I said, "I know." He said, "We would have stopped if we had known. We would have stopped the protocols and offered reparations. We would have negotiated a settlement. We are not," he searched for the word, "we are not barbaric. We did not consider them people in the same way we consider ourselves people. We understand now that this was an error. We understand now that you do not make that distinction. We wish to negotiate," I said. "I understand what you wish." He waited for more. I did not give him more. Voss was watching me, and I was watching the old spokesman, and neither of us said anything else, and after a long moment the Theresa delegation withdrew to wait for further communication from the Fleet Operations Center, which Voss had told them would be transmitted to the shelter complex's communication terminal. No further communication was transmitted to the shelter complex's communication terminal. I went back inside Vareth 7 and finished the documentation of Bay 10 and Bay 11. I want to dwell here on a thing that I did not say to the old spokesman, and that I have not said in any of the formal reports I filed in the course of the assessment, because it belongs to the record of this account rather than to an operational document. I want to dwell on the phrase he used. We did not consider them people in the same way we consider ourselves people. He said this as a mitigating fact. He said it the way one might say, we did not understand the local regulations. We were not aware the activity was prohibited. There was a failure of mutual contextual awareness. He said it as though it were a bureaucratic error, a jurisdictional confusion, the sort of thing that arises when two civilizations operating under different compact frameworks conduct transactions without full mutual comprehension of the other's legal categories. He did not say it as though it were the most precise and damning description of the offense that any being could offer in their own defense. We did not consider them people in the same way we consider ourselves people. Sorrel Han was 31 years old and came from Calder's Margin, and had a name that someone somewhere, a parent, a partner, a sibling, someone who grew up with them on whatever outer colony world Calder's Margin was, someone who called them by name at a dinner table or across a work floor or in the dark, had given them, and somewhere, in the records of the resettlement assistance protocols, their arrival at a facility like this one had been noted as cooperative transit, no complications, and their departure had been noted as substrate yield category B prime, and a line on a quarterly graph had been updated by an infinitesimal increment to reflect the contribution, and someone had drawn a quarterly efficiency assessment and noted that the yield figures were tracking satisfactorily against projected demand. I thought about this on the walk back through the facility. I thought about it carefully, the way I think about difficult things, not turning away from them, but holding them still, examining them from all sides, trying to understand exactly what they are so that I am not surprised by my own reactions in vulnerable moments. I had learned to do this in my first years as a field medic, when the things I encountered in the course of my work were frequently things that the ordinary human protective mechanisms, the ones that soften the world's sharper edges, were not equipped to manage at operational speed. You learned to look directly. You learned to know what you were looking at before you had to act. I knew what I was looking at. I filed my final documentation report from Vareth 7 at 2147 hours on the third day of the ground assessment. The report ran to 340 pages of documented observations, scanner readings, photographic and spectroscopic records, terminal data captures, and intake form transcriptions. It covered 11 processing bays, the full intake corridor complex, the administrative offices on the facility's upper level, the substrate storage vault in the facility's northern wing, and the external logistics infrastructure. The final section of the report contained my clinical assessment of the facility's processing capacity, the estimated number of human beings who had passed through it over its 61 years of operation, the estimated total substrate yield, and the estimated contribution of that yield to the Theresi longevity treatment supply. The estimated number was 134,000, give or take, depending on assumptions about capacity utilization in the early years, for which maintenance records were incomplete. Vareth 7 was one of 48 facilities on Theresi Primary. There were also facilities on Veth Secundus, on the Compact's 3 agricultural worlds, on Theresi Tertia, and on the Deep Space Processing Station in the Veth Belt that had not been detected by human intelligence until a salvaged Theresi logistics manifest recovered from a destroyed administrative hub on Day 2 revealed its existence and its coordinates. The Fleet Operations Center had dispatched 4 warships from the Calder's Reckoning Carrier Group to address the belt station within 3 hours of its identification. 47 other medics were doing what I had done in Vareth 7, in 47 other facilities across 6 worlds and 1 deep space station. The 6211, 408 figure in the CID's verified count was the documented figure, the number for which individual intake records existed or could be extrapolated from recovered data. The true number, the assessment team's aggregate estimates, suggested when the preliminary reports were compiled on Day 12, was higher. The CID had already noted in the pre-mission briefings that the first 20 years of the protocols, before administrative standardization had been imposed across the Compact's processing network, were the period for which records were most fragmentary, and that the documented figure for that period likely represented between 60 and 70% of the true intake. When the assessment team's estimates from all facilities were compiled and corrected for the early period documentation, gap, the working figure, climbed, not by a small amount. I do not put the revised figure in this account. I put the verified figure, because it is the one I can stand behind. 6,211,408 human beings, that is what the records showed. That is what the documentation established beyond any dispute with individual names, colony of origin, age, and processing facility for each. On Day 14, the Theresi Compact's remaining senior diplomatic delegation, which had been aboard a compact courier vessel that had fled to the outer system on Day 1 and had spent the subsequent 2 weeks attempting to raise a response from the 4 galactic compact bodies to which the Theresi had treaty membership, broadcast a formal message to the rendered accounts fleet. I was aboard the assessment support vessel, Cos Pellin's Answer at the time, writing up documentation from a second facility on Theresi Primary that I had assessed on Days 5 through 7. The message played on the general fleet channel, which the assessment support vessels received in full. The message was long. I have the full transcript. The core of it, which the Fleet Intelligence Summary later condensed to its essential elements, ran as follows. The Theresi Compact formally acknowledged the resettlement assistance protocols and their consequences. It acknowledged that the protocols had resulted in the deaths of a substantial number of human beings. It expressed, in the formal diplomatic register, profound regret for the distress caused. It stated that the Compact was prepared to offer full reparations to be determined in consultation with human Compact representatives, and offered a preliminary figure that was, and this was the number that circulated through the fleet's enlisted and officer channels for the better part of 2 days afterward, generating a quality of response I will not attempt to characterize, substantially larger than the memorandum author's pre-mission estimate of 4% of annual trade revenue, but still in the context of 6,211,408 human beings, a number that existed in a different moral universe than the one in which the offense had been committed. The message requested that the fleet's operational activities cease immediately pending diplomatic resolution, and invoked 4 separate compact treaty frameworks under which the Theresi argued that a cessation of hostilities was legally mandated while good faith negotiations were underway. The Fleet Operations Center acknowledged receipt. The fleet's operational activities continued on the established schedule. On Day 17, I joined the assessment team that was working Theresi Tertia, which was a smaller world with a harsher climate. The dust there was white rather than red, and the facilities were built into the hillsides rather than on open industrial ground, and the Theresi sun was further away and the sky was a harder, more brittle blue. I assessed 3 facilities on Tertia over 9 days. The facilities there were older than the ones on Primary. Tertia had been the first world in the Compact's network, the site of the original protocols before they had been expanded into the full resettlement assistance framework, and the oldest equipment I encountered dated to the protocol's earliest years, and the maintenance records I found on the oldest terminals were in an earlier form of Theresi administrative script that my overlay struggled with, and there were gaps in the records as the seed had anticipated that no documentation work could fully bridge. The first Tertia facility was the oldest in the network, the oldest known processing facility the protocols had operated. Built in the protocol's 7th year, which made it 133 years old at the time of my assessment. The equipment in its bays was a mix of generations, the original installation, which was heavier and less refined than the later designs I had seen on Primary, and several layers of subsequent modernization as thoracic biological engineering had improved the processing compounds and increased yield efficiencies over the decades. In the deepest section of the facility, in what the old administrative records described as the original Stage 1 processing bays, the walls were a different material than the later construction, a fired clay composite that the Thoraci had used in their pre-industrial period and still used occasionally in heritage construction, and the residue traces my scanner found in those walls were old enough that spectroscopic dating placed them in the protocol's first 2 decades. I spent 4 hours in those bays. The administrative records for the protocol's first years on Tertia were fragmentary in exactly the way the scifi file had predicted. Incomplete cycle, logs, batch records with yield figures but no intake names, maintenance records that covered equipment function but not throughput volumes. What the scanner found in the walls told a more complete story than the paperwork. In the wordless language of chemistry, the compounds were there, the human-specific biological markers were there. The concentrations were consistent with high-volume use across an extended period. I documented it all. I noted the gaps in what the physical evidence suggested in the absence of records. The second Tertia facility was younger and better documented, and it had something I had not encountered in any of the primary facilities. A small room off the main administrative corridor that appeared to have been used as a rest space for facility personnel. A table, several Thoraci chairs, a heating element, a shelf with what looked like personal items. The ordinary accumulation of a workplace where people spent long days. There was a Thoraci calendar on the wall, the kind with small images for each month. Landscapes, mostly the kind of images I'd come to recognize as the Thoraci aesthetic for domesticity and comfort. The calendar was from a year 43 years ago. Someone had marked several dates on it in a darker ink. Appointments, perhaps, or anniversaries, or simply the days they had intended to remember. I documented the room. I did not spend long in it. There was nothing in it that was evidence of anything except that people had worked here, and I already knew people had worked here. The whole facility was evidence of that. The evidence of people who had spent their working lives in this place processing other people, and who had apparently needed a calendar and a warm room to rest in between, and who had thought nothing of the juxtaposition. I noted the gaps. I noted everything I could determine. I noted the things I could not determine and the reasons why, and what the evidence suggested in the absence of certainty. On day 22, 3 compact member species, the Velon Cooperative, the Myrath Accord, and the Gathered Worlds of Selene, issued a joint communique calling on humanity to cease fleet operations in Thoraci space and submit the matter to compact arbitration. The communique was directed to Earth's compact delegation and to the Fleet Operations Center simultaneously. I read the text later that evening in the fleet's General Information Channel. The communique's language was careful, diplomatically neutral, legally precise, framed entirely in compact convention terms. It did not use the word atrocity in reference to the Thoraci protocols. It did not use the word atrocity at all. It used the phrase alleged systematic violation of Class 7 species designation conventions, which was the compact legal framing for what the Thoraci had done, and it referred to the fleet's operations as disproportionate unilateral action and expressed grave concern about the precedent it set for compact stability. Compact stability. I was not at the time of reading in a condition to engage in extended analysis of diplomatic language. I was in the 3rd facility on Thoraci Tertia, in a processing bay very similar to the 11 bays in Vareth 7, and my scanner was completing a spectroscopic pass of the processing equipment, and the results were very similar to what I had found in the other facilities, because the equipment was the same equipment and it had been used for the same purposes, and the walls held the same residue traces, and the overhead tracks had the same conveyance systems, and the drainage channel ran down the center of the floor with the same functional logic. I filed a notation in my personal log that evening. The Velon Cooperative, the Myrath Accord, and the Gathered Worlds of Selene had each been members of compact humanitarian convention bodies alongside the Thoraci for between 40 and 80 years. The Velon Cooperative had co-authored the Compact Framework's Class 7 species protections. I noted this without further commentary. I did not know what to do with it beyond noting it. Earth's Compact Delegation's response to the joint communique was issued the following morning and distributed on the General Fleet Channel. It was brief. It acknowledged the communique's receipt. It stated that the Rendered Accounts Fleet was operating under Earth's sovereign authority to respond to what Earth's government had determined, after 11 years of documented evidence collection, constituted an act of mass homicide against Earth's citizens. It stated that Earth did not recognize the Compact's arbitration jurisdiction over matters of this nature and cited the specific Compact Convention article, Article 14, Section 7 of the Interstellar Compact Convention on Species Sovereignty, under which Earth's position rested. It stated that Earth expected the fleet's operational activities to be completed within the remaining operational timeline, and that following the conclusion of those activities, Earth would engage with the Compact community on the question of the long-term framework for its relationship with the Theresi Compact and with Compact members who had been aware of the resettlement assistance protocols. That last phrase, who had been aware of the resettlement assistance protocols, the scifi file had a section on this. The Compact community was not small, and its information-sharing mechanisms between member species were extensive, and the Theresi Compact had been a member for 300 years, and the protocols had been in operation for 140 years, and the substrate compound had been a significant trade item in the Compact's pharmaceutical exchange for most of that time, its origin listed in Compact trade documents as biologically derived longevity compound, Theresi origin, Class 7 substrate. I had read that section of the file carefully on the transit out. For the same reason I had read the section on the mechanism of the longevity treatment. I wanted to understand the full shape of the thing, wanted to hold it whole. I held it whole. On day 29, the Theresi Compact's courier vessel, which had by then repositioned to a system 2 transits outside Compact space, broadcast another message. This one was addressed directly to the Fleet Operations Center and was marked with the Theresi diplomatic symbol for personal address. It was, in Compact convention terms, the equivalent of a head of state direct communication. I was doing documentation work on Hakas Pellin's answer when it came through, and I listened to it in full on the general channel. The speaker identified himself as First Administrator Vareth Sorel of the Theresi Compact. The compound honorific was the highest governmental rank in the Compact's administrative hierarchy, the position that had held executive authority over the resettlement assistance protocols for the past 32 years. He was, by any available measure, the primary living administrative authority for what had been done to 6,211,408 human beings. He spoke for 22 minutes. I listened to all of it. I am not going to reproduce all of it here. I will reproduce the passage that I transcribed into my personal log immediately after the broadcast ended, because it is the passage I have returned to most often in the years since, and because it belongs in this account. He said, I want you to understand that I authorized these protocols with the full belief that they represented a mutual benefit arrangement, one that used the biological material of a species that your own Compact designation frameworks, at the time of the protocol's initiation, classified as pre-Compact, sub-administrative, and not yet party to full Class 7 protections. I want you to understand that I did this inside a legal framework. I want you to understand that I had reports from biologists, from Compact legal specialists, from species relations advisors, and not one of them said, this is wrong. I want you to understand that I am not a monster. I have grandchildren. I love them. I have watched them grow up in a civilization that I built and administered and tried to keep safe, and I have given 80 years of my life to that work. And I am telling you that I did not understand what I was doing. I am telling you that I understand now. I am telling you that nothing I offer can be sufficient. I am telling you anyway, because you deserve to hear it. I am sorry. I am sorry for what we did to them. I am sorry for every name and every intake form. I am sorry, and I am asking you to stop. He said, please. He said, I am asking you to stop. I am asking you to let us live with what we have done. I am asking you to let us try to make it right in the ways that are still available to us. I am asking you, please, to stop. I listened to all of it. The Fleet Operations Center acknowledged receipt of the communication. The fleet's operations continued on the established schedule. I want to say something about this that I have not said in any official report, because it is not the sort of observation that belongs in an official report, but it belongs here. I want to say that I listened to First Administrator Vareth Sorel's message in its entirety, and I heard the grief in it, or what I interpreted as grief, bearing in mind that I was listening across a species barrier through translation. Software and my interpretation may have been incomplete, and I noted the grief, and I believed it was real, as much as I could believe anything across that distance, and I continued to believe it had nothing to do with what the fleet was doing. This is the hardest thing I have to say about the 58 days, and I say it as someone who spent her career trying to preserve life, who chose the medical branch because she believed in the weight of a single living body and the obligation to maintain it, who had sat in field hospitals on 4 different contested worlds and fought for people she had never met and would never see again, because fighting for them was what the work required. I say it as that person, I say it plainly. I did not want the fleet to stop. I wanted it to finish. Not because of hatred, not out of rage. I was not in a rage. I was in the state that the elegiac register I noted in my own voice during this period was trying to describe, which was not anger but something on the other side of anger, in the territory past which you arrive only after you have looked at the graph in Bay 6 long enough and walked through enough processing bays and read enough intake forms and done enough arithmetic and held the full shape of the thing still in your mind long enough to understand that what you are looking at is not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, not a failure of mutual contextual awareness. It is a decision. Someone decided to do this. Many people decided to do this. They decided to do this inside legal frameworks and administrative procedures and quarterly efficiency assessments, and they did it for 140 years. And the thing that allowed them to do it, the thing that made the paperwork clean, and the graph, line smooth and the intake notes say cooperative transit, no complications, was the decision not to consider human beings people in the same way they considered themselves people. That decision had consequences. The rendered accounts fleet was one of them. I was one of them, walking through those bays with my scanner and my documentation array, collecting the evidence with the same systematic thoroughness that the Theresi had applied to their own records. Thoroughness for thoroughness, accountability for accountability, not more, not less. What the rendered accounts fleet did was not chaos, it was not rage, it was organized at scale, methodical, cold, and it addressed exactly what it had been dispatched to address, in the order it had been planned to address it, on the schedule that had been established before we broke transit, and it did not stop because someone said please. You do not get to stop the accounting by saying please. You do not get to wait until you understand what you did wrong and then purchase amnesty with that understanding. You do not get to invoke legal frameworks to interrupt a reckoning that your legal frameworks spent 140 years enabling. These are the things I believed then and I believe now, and I say them knowing that there are people, thoughtful people, people who would have read the same file I read and walked through the same facilities I walked through, who would argue that the fleet went too far, that a proportionate response was possible, that the targeting of the compact subsidiary worlds was excessive, that the administrative cities should have been spared, that the civilian populations of the Theresi primary worlds were not individually culpable. I know those arguments. I sat with them in the nights on Theresi Tertia in the white dust and the brittle blue sky, when the work was done for the day, and the documentation was filed, and there was nothing to do but think. I sat with them honestly. I did not find them wrong, exactly. I found them beside the point in the way that all arguments about proportionality are beside the point when the offense itself was the systematic erasure of proportionality as a concept, when the entity you are proposing proportional accountability for spent 140 years deciding that proportionality did not apply to the people it was using. These are not comfortable positions. I do not offer them as comfortable. I offer them as the positions I arrived at through the only process I know for arriving at positions. Looking directly at the thing, holding it still, understanding what it is. On day 41, the Deep Space Processing Station in the Veth Belt was addressed. The 4 warships dispatched from the Calder's Reckoning Carrier Group had taken longer to reach the belt station than expected, because the station's coordinates in the recovered logistics manifest had been slightly corrupted, and the warships had spent 3 days running a search pattern before locating it. The station was large, larger than the surface facilities, purpose-built for high-volume processing, the facility records showing peak operational periods during the years in which the surface facilities had been at capacity and the overflow had been redirected. I did not assess it myself. The belt station's assessment was handled by a separate element, and their preliminary report came to Hocus Pellin's answer as part of the Fleet Intelligence Summary. I read the summary but not the full report. The summary figures for the belt station were not small. I noted them and moved on. On day 47, I was back on Theresi Primary for the second time, finishing documentation on the last unassessed facilities in the industrial zones outside the third city. The governmental administrative center in that city had been addressed on day 2. The ruins were settled now. The thin smoke columns long since dispersed, the structures collapsed to their foundations, the reddish dust already beginning to drift over the rubble in the patterns that undisturbed dust eventually finds. I walked past the ruins to reach the facility, and the path between them was very quiet, and the copper-colored sky above was very clear, and there was nothing overhead. The last facility on my assignment list was smaller than Vareth 7. 6 processing bays rather than 11. a shorter intake corridor, a less extensive administrative office section. It had been operational for 38 years. The maintenance records on its terminals were complete for all 38 years. I assessed it in one day. In the intake corridor, on a desk near the main entrance, there was a small framed image, decorative, personal, the sort of thing a worker places in their workspace over years of daily presence. It showed a Tharesi landscape, a sunset, orange and gold, over a low mountain range, the kind of image that communicates across any species barrier, something like, "This is a place I love," or "This is beautiful to me," or simply, "I have been here and it mattered." I documented the image. I cataloged it as personal effects of facility administrative personnel, probable date of placement unknown. I noted its presence in my report. Then I went to Bay 1 and started the work. I filed my final report from Tharesi Primary on day 50. The compiled total from all assessment teams' documentation, integrated into the Fleet Intelligence Section's master archive by day 52, represented the most comprehensive forensic record of the Tharesi resettlement assistance protocols that had ever been assembled. 347 individual assessment reports, spectroscopic and chemical evidence from 48 surface facilities, and 1 deep space station. Complete or near-complete administrative and maintenance records from 31 of those facilities. Partial records from the remaining 18, with the gaps documented and the estimation methodology for those gaps recorded in full. Individual intake records for 6,211,408 human beings by name. Names, I keep coming back to names. There was a period in the middle weeks of the assessment, somewhere around day 20, when I started keeping a secondary log alongside my official documentation. A list of names, just the names, drawn from intake forms across every facility I assessed personally. Not the yield grades, not the assessment scores, not the processing lane designations, just the names. I kept the list in my personal documentation archive, not the official record. By day 50, it ran to slightly more than 11,000 entries. I understood from the arithmetic, that this list was an infinitesimal fraction of the total. That did not make me stop adding to it. The names were the specific, irreducible, individual truth of what the forms recorded in aggregate. On day 55, the rendered accounts fleet completed its operational sweep of Veth Secundus and the 3 agricultural worlds. The 11th carrier group, which had handled the agricultural worlds in parallel with the primary operations, rendezvoused with the main fleet in the Veth inner system. The fleet consolidated, 883 warships, the same number we had arrived with. We had lost no ships, because the Tharesi had not been equipped to fight a war at this scale, because they had not been at war with a peer adversary in 3,000 years, because they had not imagined this was coming. The fleet consolidated and ran its inventory and confirmed its operational completeness and began the computational work of calculating the transit back. I want to be precise about what operational completeness meant, because I think it is sometimes misunderstood in the accounts I have read and in the conversations I have had. The rendered accounts fleet did not destroy the Tharesi people. The civilian populations of the 11 worlds remained. The cities that were not adjacent to military or governmental infrastructure remained, or remained in substantial part. Agriculture and water infrastructure had not been targeted. The Tharesi would be hungry and disorganized and frightened, and they would be without government and without military and without the administrative infrastructure that had run their civilization for 3,000 years, and the recovery from that would be slow and would cost lives in the secondary effects. Disrupted supply chains, absent medical administration, the ordinary catastrophes that follow the removal of civil order at scale. I knew that. The Fleet Command knew that. It was not accidental. But the Tharesi people were alive. The Tharesi cities stood. The Tharesi children, and I thought about this during those last days, the children, the ones who had no intake forms in their name and no role in the decision-making and no culpability for what their civilization had done, the Tharesi children were alive, and whatever happened to them next was a consequence their civilization had created by its decisions, and the weight of that consequence was not something I was willing to place anywhere except where it belonged. I had walked through 49 processing facilities across 2 worlds and 1 deep space station. I had the names of 11,000 people in a log in my personal archive. I knew what the Tharesi had decided, and I knew what a civilization that decides people are resources produces in itself over 140 years of acting on that decision. It produces precisely the administrative culture I had documented, the efficiency graphs and the yield projections and the polished stone on the intake, desk and the rest room with the calendar, all of it coexisting without friction, because the friction had been designed out of the system by the Original decision not to see the humans as people in the way that they themselves were people. You do not produce that result without making that decision continuously, over 140 years, at every level of the administrative structure that touched the protocols. It was not the decision of First Administrator Vareth Sorel alone. It was not the decision of the 9 members of the Vareth Administrative Compact. It was the decision of a civilization, repeated and maintained and institutionalized in quarterly efficiency assessments and facility restrooms and compact pharmaceutical trade documents and 7 galactic compact memberships that had never asked the question loudly enough to require an answer. On day 57, a final broadcast came from the Theresi diplomatic courier vessel, which was still in the outer system. First Administrator Vareth Sorel was not the speaker this time. The speaker was someone younger. I did not have a name for the voice, and the Fleet Intelligence Summary did not provide one, and the message was short. It said that the Theresi Compact no longer had a capital world from which to govern. It said that the Compact's administrative and governmental infrastructure was gone. It said that the Theresi people were still alive on their worlds, in their cities that remained, those that remained, and in their shelters and their homes and their ordinary lives, and that they did not know what would happen to them next, and that they were afraid, and that the speaker was transmitting this not as a diplomatic communication, but simply because there was no one left to transmit to and no other option remaining but to speak into the silence and hope it reached someone. The broadcast ended. The Fleet Operations Center did not respond. On day 58, the rendered accounts fleet entered transit formation and broke for home. I was on the observation deck of Hakas Pellin's Answer when the transit sequence initiated. The deck had a forward viewport, roughly 4 meters wide, through which the Veth system was visible. The copper-orange star at its center, the planets in their orbits, the belt where the Deep Space Processing Station had been and was no longer. It was the end of the operational day cycle on the ship, and the viewport showed the local star in what my eye translated as late afternoon, though the concept was arbitrary at this distance. The light was warm and old and came a very long way to reach the glass. I thought about Sorel Han from Calder's Margin. I had thought about Sorel Han many times since the first morning in Vareth 7, and I expected I would continue to think about Sorel Han for the rest of my life, and I did not think this was wrong or disproportionate or an unhealthy relationship to a stranger whose face I had never seen and whose voice I had never heard and who had been dead for longer than I had been alive. The intake form was the only record of them that I had found in my assessed facilities. There were, somewhere in the Fleet Intelligence Master Archive, the records from other facilities, compiled by other assessment teams, and Sorel Han might have a larger presence in those records, or Sorel Han might be exactly as present in the whole as in the small portion I had, personally documented. One name in one intake form, in a neat phonetic approximation in a foreign script, on a desk in a room that had been built to process human beings, held flat by a polished stone. I looked at the light through the viewport for a long time. Then the transit sequence completed, and the stars shifted, and Theresi space was gone. I have been asked, since the operation, whether I believe what the rendered accounts fleet did was just. This is asked in different ways by different people. Some ask it because they genuinely want to know. Some ask it because they want to argue. Some ask it because they are wrestling with the same question themselves and want to witness who was there. I give the same answer each time, and it is not the answer most people are looking for, which is perhaps why I am asked it repeatedly. I do not know if it was just. I know what it was. It was what happened when an ancient species spent 140 years deciding that human beings were not people in the way that they themselves were people, and spent 140 years acting on that decision with bureaucratic precision and quarterly efficiency, assessments, and learned, on the day that the rendered accounts fleet broke transit into their system, that the decision had been wrong. It was what happened when a civilization that had existed for 30,000 years and sat on 7 galactic compacts and filed its paperwork correctly and framed its atrocity in legal language, and took the polished stone from its desk and set it down, looked up, and found the consequence standing in the doorway. It was what 6,011,408 people cost. They paid every gram of it. And the last thing I will say is this: I did not want to be there. I did not want to walk through those bays with my scanner and my documentation array and find what was there to find. I did not want to read the intake forms or sit in front of the graph in Bay 6 or listen to First Administrator Vareth Sorel's 22 minutes. I did not want to compile a list of 11,000 names that I would carry for the rest of my life, and that would wake me sometimes in the small hours not as nightmare but as weight, as the specific irreducible individual weight of 11,000 people who were gone and who deserved at minimum to be known by name. I did not want any of it. But I was glad the fleet was there. I was glad there were 883 of us, and I was glad we stayed for 58 days, and I was glad we did not stop when the first administrator said please, not out of hardness, not out of cruelty, because the opposite of what the Theresi had done, the opposite of the decision to treat 6-2 and 11, 408 human beings as resource rather than person, was not softness. It was the refusal to accept that their lives could be weighed on any scale found insufficient. The fleet was that refusal. 883 warships and one field medic with a documentation array and a list of names. That is what it looked like. That is what it cost. That is what we owed them.